everybody, welcome back. We've had a little bit of a break. We're feeling refreshed, rejuvenated. I'm seeing some faces on my Zoom screen that don't look like they're quite as refreshed, rejuvenated. No, they are. They're on it. So welcome back to the podcast. And I suppose this series, we really wanted to think a little bit more about kind of, we come into this being 4 women of the global majority, and we really wanted to focus a little bit this series on the kind of marginalization, that word, of people of the global majority. And we kind of frame it as that we are people of the global majority, but actually living, working, existing in this kind of, in the UK, we are very aware that there are times when we get quote unquote marginalized, and we are minoritized. And we really wanted to think a little bit about existing and moving in those spaces. And with that in mind, we're going to be covering, amongst many other topics, we're going to be thinking about toxic masculinity, like accessing therapy, and thinking a little bit about colorism, amongst other topics as well.
Hi guys, we're really looking forward to bringing you guys on this journey for this next. To get into that, we wanted to shout out a few people that have reached out to us via email, which we're really grateful for. So there's Joe, there's Akila, and there's Judy, and it's just been really nice. Sort of, I feel like we have like little pen friends that you're having like online chats with, and they've actually shared some stuff with us, some topics and that they have in mind, and we're really grateful for that, because we've been actually thinking about it, and we're hoping that we might touch on some of those topics in some future episodes. So you're gonna have to stay tuned to see whether your episode comes up. That's the and Akila. So yeah, just thank you guys, and please guys, do email us, send us your ideas, your thoughts about the topics and the things that we do talk about.
I guess something else I kind of was also thinking about, in terms of people's reactions to the first season, it's been really interesting. And some of these topics that we're coming up with in the next series, I'm calling it, is also to do with people's reactions, but also to do with, I want to say in the workplace, some of the conversations as a result of us kind of doing this podcast, but also as a result of additional conversations. So there's going to be lots of that to come as well.
Yeah, I think what I'd probably say is the last season is probably more, it was more, I guess it felt like warming the context. It felt like it was sort of an introduction to who we are, a little bit about our lives. I think with this season, I'm going in with the frame of mind of being more honest, more open. Well, I think Mariam said something I really liked in the end of the last episode, which is being unapologetically her. So I'm going to go into this season with that mind frame, I think. But yeah, lots of really interesting topics, lots of really good suggestions from the emails we've got, and yeah, it's just been such an interesting experience, and I'm really looking forward to the upcoming episodes, and I hope you are too.
You mentioned warming the context for Zana, and you know how Lola would be. What does that mean for anyone who's listening? I wonder whether you'd be able to elaborate. Anyone can elaborate on that.
I mean, I guess I asked, so I guess maybe I would elaborate, but I guess if I get it right. But no, I guess woman, the context is, imagine you're watching a play, or you're in a play and you're kind of setting the scene, you're setting the mood of what's to come. Does that make sense? I think that's what woman, the context is. So just giving you a bit of a flavor of an idea of what's to come. But actually, whilst you were talking, and I know you're going to be like, Lola, why are you coming up with these questions? But you know me, I know you said Mariam said she wants to be unapologetically her, and I guess, what does that look like for you, Fazana, and even to you, Mariam, because I know you said it initially. What does that look like for you as well?
I think for me, it was probably, I almost felt like, because it was the first season, or the first few episodes, I probably was I know I said warming the context, and I meant warming the context for the audience, but I think I was also warming the context for myself in some way, kind of mentally preparing myself to be more open, which I feel like I probably wasn't as before, because I think, like I said, this whole podcasting thing is very new. The idea of having an audience is very new to me. So I think it just means sharing my experiences and talking from my perspective without the worry of how that would come across. Obviously, it would be as ethical as possible, but it's just that worry of, have I come across a certain way? Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what I mean.
It makes perfect sense, Fazana. And I was thinking about kind of when I mentioned kind of that frame of being unapologetically kind of myself. That was a frame at that point, and and time has punctuated or changed things. The time has moved on. Maybe I am more apologetic, but I suppose for me, in terms of this season, I would like us to be more raw and more kind of I don't want to say cutthroat. I don't intend it to be in a negative way, any type of shame, but I don't want us to hold back, because I think we were really tentative in the previous season, and I want us to be more raw and say in the same way that the live conversation in a very raw kind of manner, and in terms of experiences and some of the topics that we're going to be talking about, and I said earlier on, like, heavy topics. We're not heavy topics in a negative way, but these are things that don't get talked about, and this is why we started this podcast, is to talk about things that don't get talked about in kind of the spheres that we're in, and that's part of kind of bringing that in a raw sense that I'm hoping that we are going to be doing, that you should look forward to us doing.
I really liked what you said, Mariam, actually, in terms of talking about those things that are not talked about. And actually, whilst you were saying, I was even thinking about, sometimes we do talk about it, but amongst ourselves, isn't it? Amongst people that we feel safe around. And in a weird way, I know we're not talking to people physically, but we're hoping that this is a safe space where the things that we do talk about, you feel like actually you're being heard, and your voice is being heard if you've never been able to maybe voice some of the things that we hopefully talk about, which is why we do really encourage you guys to reach out to us and let us know any thoughts that you have. And obviously, if you wanted to do something that was, quite deep or personal, we obviously wouldn't shout you out with your name, or go into those details, for example. But it's really important that we know that, other people out there, hopefully, that are marginalized, hopefully we are covering some of your voices that maybe it's been silenced, or you felt like you haven't been able to share in the past.
I think that's a really, really good point, Lola, because I think it can be really, I think, reflecting on what you were saying, Mariam, about that kind of being authentic and being unapologetic, there's also something a little bit about, and I know for me, definitely there's a tentativeness, because sometimes there's a wish to maybe not get things quote unquote kind of wrong, or to make sure that what you're saying is not something that's going to unintentionally cause offense to somebody else. But I think in the spaces that we're working in and the things that we're thinking about, actually we want to work sensitively, and we want to think about things in a way that doesn't cause offense. But then actually, by the nature of the topics that we talk about, actually it is quite triggering for people. And it, my perspective is just that, it's just my perspective, and it's not going to be, and this is a space to kind of learn and hear other voices. And actually part of that is being open to hearing perspectives of people whose experiences you may not be able to connect with fully. And that is why, as Lola said, it's really, really helpful if we can hear from listeners, people who have connected in one way or the other, or who don't connect at all. That's part.
I think I wanted to also add something about safety and uncomfortability, is that it's all right to be uncomfortable. And some of the things we talk about might feel uncomfortable, but that's all right. It's all right to kind of be in that space. And something someone said to me recently was about the uniqueness of experiences, and that being really, really important. So whilst we might have a lot of similarities and differences, the uniqueness in one's experience from whatever kind of background they come from, or whatever race they are, or whatever kind of culture they have, or religious or ethnicity background, whatever the uniqueness of their experience is really rich and it's really important. And I think systemic work allows for that space, allows for that, and facilitates that and accepts that. And this is why it's really important to have these conversations, from my perspective anyway, because that uniqueness is valid and is accepted, but also it's all right to open that up as well in a wider context.
Yeah, I was thinking about this actually, but more from a perspective of audience that are listening in. I guess there is a difference between, I think uncomfortability is something, I guess in our clinical work, it would be like, oh, you don't want to make your clients uncomfortable, for example, or you don't want to cause any uncomfortability. But I think there is a big difference between being uncomfortable and like managing like psychological safety, for example. So I think sometimes when we talk about difficult experiences from our own perspective, of course, they're not going to bring up good emotions. They're not going to bring up good feelings. And I think it's important to normalize that, because that's part of the processing. But I guess it's where we draw the line is when it becomes distressing. And I think it's, yeah. So yeah, I think it's okay to feel uncomfortable when we are talking about difficult things. And I think that's where maybe that's going to show in this season more, because I think maybe that was my reluctancy in the last few episodes.
I think you raise a really good point there, Fazan, because there's something about like working in this kind of space in terms of working with racial trauma, especially, there's something about being re-traumatized because you're actually still existing in spaces where racial injustices occur, and you're having to navigate that. And then on top of that, you're hearing the experiences of people of the global you might be working with who are also experiencing that. And then you're coming into this, for me anyway, then I'm coming into this space and talking about it. And I think it's making sure there aren't too many points where I'm actually becoming really unsettled by the conversations, and it making it somewhere that, and it's definitely why I bring certain things and I maybe don't bring other things. And it's definitely part of that self-regulation that I think as people of the global majority, we have to be able to do in order to survive, existing in a world that is in a space that is, built on white supremacy. It's really, really hard to navigate that and to maintain anything that feels like it's what is framed as good mental health, quote unquote. So yeah, that's definitely part of my hesitancy. Also, I'm just like super, super private, so.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that actually. I guess something that came to mind, especially when you were both talking, actually, is I guess what is it about systemic thinking or systemic therapy? What ideas in there actually have we found that's helpful maybe in terms of navigating some of these things and some of these conversations? I don't know if that makes sense. And is there any part of systemic thinking or therapy or theories that actually maybe reinforce some of these sort of marginalizations that we're talking about? I don't know, do you get what I mean? I think it'll be really good to maybe get into that, because we are unconventional, as our name says, and it's like, actually, yes, we're learning all this new stuff, and some of it we are finding useful from our own lenses, but actually, is there stuff that maybe for us, I don't know, reinforces some of the things that we're trying to move away from, or are there things that actually align with what we're trying to maybe achieve or work towards? It'd be really good to think about that as well.
That's a really good question. I think immediately I had like words popping up, like key concepts popping up into my mind, and like it was things like power, things like social graces, things like ethics. I think what initially drew me to systemic work in general was this idea that we're not just focusing on what's happening in the now, we're taking people's social context into consideration to how it's influencing a lot of what's happening for them, whether that's, I know Megan mentioned kind of like racial trauma, what kind of ethnic background do they fit in? What kind of social class group are they in? And how does that influence how things are? Because I think there is this idea about, well, not initially, but thinking about a lot of people who I've spoken to who don't have any experience with therapy or training in therapy, a lot of what they say is, well, if the housing, so for example, if we sorted out the housing market, or if we got rid of poverty, then, you know, mental health, the waiting list in mental health would go down, which is true. And I think that's what I like about systemic thinking, is that we're acknowledging actually there are more than just things beyond, there are things that are happening beyond the therapy room that are going to influence it. And unfortunately, that's the constraints of this work, that we're not going to be able to control it. But there is that element of acknowledging that these things are being experienced and these things are influencing it, and really validating that. So I think for me, that's what kind of came to mind.
I was thinking about, in addition to what Fazana was saying in answering aspects of your question, Lola, but I'm aware that a lot more of this is gonna come in the kind of upcoming episodes. I was thinking about, kind of as you were talking about power, I was thinking about dominance, shy stories and shame stories as well, which is part of the things for me that links perhaps into kind of people's reactions, or kind of the aspect of re-traumatizing, but also the aspects of adversity and how people might approach that, you know, in terms of whether I think there's a paper by someone that I need to read that someone spoke to me about, around kind of where in adversities and in the trauma from adversity, people go the other way, as opposed to kind of becoming I want to say subjugated by that trauma. They have this kind of opposite reaction of being really resilient and kind of rejecting the impact of the trauma in a completely opposite way. I can't say the person's name who did the paper, but I'm sure it's somewhere, and I if I remember, I will get back to you guys. But I need to read the paper properly. But I was thinking about that in terms of also some of the things that that are really important to consider when we're talking about some of the topics that we'll talk about, because our intention is not to re-traumatize anyone. Our intention is not to kind of, like, you know, cause for any kind of harm or anything like that. Is to perhaps have things go the opposite way, in terms of positive way, in a resilient, but also acknowledging how intense some of these things can be in terms of how they impact our lives.
Yeah, I think I know, Lola, it looked like you were thinking, trying to connect what Mariam was saying in terms of the paper, and we were thinking between us in our little messaging, we were thinking that paper might have been the Coping with Adversity, the Barry Mason paper. But off the back of what you were saying, Mariam, I was thinking a lot about narrative therapy, and that's something that definitely, in terms of the stories that we tell of ourselves and what are the kind of dominant plots, the dominant themes that come out through those stories. And a lot of the time, not a lot of the time, some of the time that can be based on kind of the societal constructs of what stories can we actually tell of ourselves? Like, what are acceptable stories for people of the global majority, or people who look a certain way, or who hold beliefs in a certain way? What are the stories that we're allowed to tell of ourselves? And then what are the stories that we aren't allowed to tell of ourselves? And in thinking about narrative, it's thinking about those alternative narratives, the stories that don't get told, and the stories that are the exception to those rules. So there's always exceptions to, you know, I say, just like I was saying earlier on, like, oh, I'm very, very private, I'm terribly private, but actually sometimes I can overshare. That's an alternative narrative there, but actually I do overshare at times. It depends on the context, but it's in narrative. It's definitely a theme that I come back to quite a lot, is thinking about, okay, well, a concept that I really connect to is thinking about, okay, what are those stories that we don't share of ourselves, and how can we thicken those plots, the alternative stories, how can we build on those exception stories? So that's something definitely that I really resonate with. And I think on the flip side to that question that you asked, Lola, and I know it's a question that I think Joe had, one of our email correspondents, had put in, was the idea of what concepts do we connect with, but what are the ones that we find really unhelpful? And I don't necessarily know if there are some that I find unhelpful so much as ones that I find don't maybe acknowledge those social graces, the kind of the more social constructionist kind of ideas, and some of those are the more manualized approaches that I find those can be quite jarring. The concepts can be quite jarring, but it's not to say that you can't apply thinking about, you know, social graces. It's just it feels a little bit clunkier.
That's really interesting, actually. When you were talking, Megan, I was also thinking about when you talked about narrative sort of therapy and the stories, I was thinking about also the stories that we can share with certain people. Does that make sense? So the stories that we bring to certain spaces, and depending on who is the listener, who is the one receiving that story, will also depend how you say it. I know for me anyway, how I say it, what I include or exclude. And I think that's really interesting as well to think about. But when you were also talking about the theories that we're drawn to more, or the ones that we find more helpful, I think, yeah, definitely we need to get into a bit more in an episode. But I'm really looking forward actually to this next season. I hope you guys do look forward to it as well. And hopefully also you learn a bit more about systemic thinking and systemic therapy as well. And yeah, I'm quite excited. I'm really excited for that actually. But I think we wanted to keep this quite short, just so that we can just give you guys a bit of a flavor of what's to come as well over the next few episodes too. So yeah, was there any closing remarks that anyone wants to share?
I wanted to add a bit of a disclaimer again, sorry. Because, you know, whilst we're saying that, you know, help people learn about systemic, we're still in training, right? So like, we're not experts, and I don't know if anyone could ever say they're an expert in terms of systemic thinking. However, yeah, that we're human, and, you know, we make mistakes, but this is our opinion, these are our lens, our own lenses, our own experiences. So take it as that. It's you know, it's we're not here to kind of give a generalized view of what everyone from a global majority might think or might feel or whatever. This is our perspective. So I just want to kind of remind people of that once again.
Definitely, Mariam, and even in that as well, I'm sure we probably wouldn't always agree on certain things that we might talk about, because I know Megan was like, she's not a big fan of manualized approaches, whereas I love them, but not sticking to them rigidly. But I think there's parts of them that I find helpful, that I pick out and maybe integrate with other things as well. But definitely what Mariam said, it's our interpretation of what we're learning. And again, and that also comes from our lived experiences, our backgrounds, and I guess the spaces that we're in as well.
So I suppose on that note, welcome back. And we will look forward to kind of touching base and developing our conversations around systemic thinking, systemic practice, our personal journeys, our experiences as people of the global majority, and looking at all the intersections that lay between that. Thanks for joining us. Bye.